Hi everyone, this is Grace, and today I'll be walking you through how I made this adorable set of pies. I love this set so much. I'm just using 2 cutters from Brighton Cutters, linked in the description. Let's get started in my ode to pie. So I did 6 different pies for this set, and I wanted there to be some degree of continuity, so there's only 2 different cutters, and then I did 2 different pie pans, 2 different types. This one reminds me of that blue tin one with the white splatter on it. I'm sure there's a more official name than that, but that's mine for now. And doing a 1 consistency outline and flood for that, letting that crust over nicely. And I am splattering on some edible paint. I often prefer to use edible paint when painting on white. I've just found, at least doing splatter and this kind of thing, that it's just the best way to go, in my personal opinion. I've never had good luck with, say, using white gel food coloring. No. So edible paint all the way. And I highly recommend doing that part first so you can be messy with your splatter and not worry about getting your splatter anywhere else. So for this cherry pie, now I had a different idea initially about how I was going to execute this cherry pie, which is why you're seeing me paint on this first layer. I'm pretty sure ultimately I end up covering all of this anyway with piping, but oh well. This is a great technique if you don't want to pipe a bajillion little cherries. You can just paint on some sort of usually piping consistency, like a soft or medium peak. Let that dry and then pipe on top. So in a rare occasion here, I am actually using a piping tip. And that is because I use a piping tip for all of the crust I do in this video, and it was mostly because of what I'm doing right here with the lattice. So I don't need a piping tip. I can cut it the way I want it to for the crust, like the bigger part of the crust, but this lattice really needs to be flat, and I personally have not figured out how to cut a tipless piping bag so that it has a flat a flat tip to it, but is not really thick icing. So I've done that before, but in order to get something this wide, the amount of icing coming out of the bag is just ridiculous. So the icing tip is the only way I know how to actually get a flat pipe that's not too much icing. So I'm piping my cherries here, and I definitely intended these to be a thicker consistency, like a solid soft peak, maybe even a medium peak. No, I'm guessing I want it to be soft peak. These here, though, are definitely past a soft peak. These are approaching flood. You can even see that they're kind of blobbing together, and I didn't realize this until I started piping them. Panic central. And I was like, oh no, what do I do? So here, I'm rolling with the punches. I let those crust over the first layer, and now I'm going through and just piping a bunch of extra cherries that do not touch each other, because even though it's a little thin and they're kind of blobbing together, as long as I pipe them far enough apart, they'll stay on their own, happy grace. Actually looks like individual cherries. And also I like the fact that the cherries are just kind of coming out of the lattice. So tasty. All right, this is one of the many crusts that I did here. This is just holding the tip perpendicular to the surface and just kind of moving back and forth. I'm not changing the vertical at all of that piping tip. It's just a motion back and forth parallel to the cookie or to the surface, if that makes sense. Using a stiff peak piping consistency here for some whipped cream. And by the way, that the pie crust is like a medium peak. So here's another pie. This is the second pie pan that I did. And this one is like a metal pie pan. I'd actually had high hopes to do a glass pie pan, which I think would have been so cool, but the technique I was hoping to do to make it look like glass it didn't work. So I had to pivot, come up with a different pie pan, and I'm happy with this one. So same thing, one consistency outline in flood. Going to allow that to crust. Now I'm just going to pipe on some detail on top. And fairly certain this is a soft peak. I like to do soft peak for line work, but certainly a medium peak is fine. And honestly, if you're a beginner, anywhere in the peak department, I mean, hopefully not a stiff peak, but anywhere in a soft, medium peak range, totally fine for your line work when you first get started. I'm just using a damp brush here to kind of perfect the ends of those lines. And here I am using the Sugar Art New Silver. This is a sterling pearl. And this is a pretty thin application. I'm not really sure why I did it so thin, because it forced me to apply it twice. Wah wah. I know that the Sugar Art has some new silver sterling pearls just came out, and I'm super excited to try them. But I made these before, well before the new products came out. So I let that dry, and now I'm going in with a second coat because I really wanted this to be a good clean coat. Now, a way to avoid having to do a second coat of a metallic like this, if it's not quite opaque enough, is to actually flood the base much closer to the metallic color. So I could have flooded this in gray and maybe then wouldn't have had to do a second coat. So this is the pecans, or pecans, depending on where you're from. And I'm using a medium to a stiff peak here. Probably, yeah, somewhere between a medium and stiff peak, I would say. And I am using a tip. I'll link that in the description. And I'm just piping these on to some leftover food grade cellophane bags. You could do this on top of parchment paper, anything that's food grade. So I wouldn't just do this on top of a piece of plastic, in other words. And they don't have to be perfect. I did try to make them as flat as possible. Like, I don't really like the fact that they tapered off, because they're supposed to look like pecans, right? So pecans are flat, or if that makes sense. But in order to finish the pecans, I had to like press onto the surface of the plastic, which inevitably then kind of gave a taper to my little pecans. But there we go. And I let those dry. So I actually did those early on. I think probably that was the first thing that I did. And now here I am. I'm piping a very thick outline with piping consistency because I really wanted this to hold in my flood and my pecans. I didn't wait for it to dry, the outline, because I didn't want there to be a crusted outline interfering with my flood and my pecan situation. You can kind of get it to melt together if you flood it right away. But I went for a really thick flood because it needs, a really thick outline, because it really needs to hold in a lot of stuff. When you put any kind of sprinkle on top of a flood, it's just going to press that flood down and it's going to want to fall right off the cookie. So I'm using these fun tweezers here. I'll link those in the description. I only use these for sprinkles. And I'm just placing these cute little sprinkled pecans on, trying not to be too systematic about it, but I know me, and I tend to be very systematic, because that's just how my brain works. It's a real effort for me to make it look more natural and inconsistent, like a pecan pie. Although, now that I'm thinking about it, there are definitely pecan pies out there that have perfectly placed pecans, which just amazes me to no end. So cool. But speaking of so cool, I mean, I think the way that I did this pecan pie is pretty flippin' cool. I don't think I've seen anyone else do this. I wanted to come up with something different, something super fun, super extra. And I just love how this turned out. It's not done yet. Don't you worry. We got some more to do. So place those pecans. Don't put too many, but put enough on there. That might have gone to the too many, but you can kind of press them in a little bit. That's okay. And then I go a step further here. So once I place all of my pecans, I let the icing just crust over. And I'm actually intentionally pressing the pecans in because I wanted the surface to kind of crack. It was looking too smooth and too perfect, seeing the bits of flooded icing. And now I'm intentionally cracking any flooded icing that's showing up. And I just think it makes it look more realistic, which I think is awesome. Oh, my little pecan baby. All right, let that dry a little bit more. Going in with my crust here. This is the same exact tip that I used the last time. This has the smaller bit, I believe, on top. Yes, it does. Holding this perpendicular to the cookie and just a back and forth zigzag motion. And there we go, friends. That is the pecan pie. Up next, we have the key lime pie. I grew up eating probably more key lime pie than most people would, at least people who don't live in Florida. I love key lime pie because my mom loves key lime pie, but I'm very picky about my key lime pie. It has to have two things. First of all, it has to have a graham cracker crust, and then the inside needs to like melt in your mouth, not be gelatinous. If you know what I mean, you know, you know. So this was another opportunity to have some fun with some crust. That's also part of the reason that I picked the pies that I did. Well, actually, I guess there are only two really different crusts, and that would be the graham cracker crust for the key lime pie and then the lattice crust on the cherry. I did want to get some variety in the kind of crusts that I was showing here. So this is the same way that we started the cherry pie. Now I will say I make a mistake here. You do want to allow this splatter to dry before you do the crust for this pie. So just keep that in mind. I didn't allow it to fully dry, and you will see why that's a problem in a moment. Now, doing the little flood for the key lime. I did wonder to myself if I should have flooded a layer up, but I felt like the top bit was just for whipped cream, but then it's like a heavy whipped cream ratio on this pie cutter, which is not a problem. Who doesn't love whipped cream? But here we are. All right, so some other notes. I'm not really sure. All I remember is that it was very hard for me to get this green. I think it was a more yellowy green for the key lime. And then, oh, okay, this pie crust here, actually, what I'm doing right now doesn't really matter. You could just do a line of, I suppose, of icing, but I wanted it to really get in there and have a bit of dimension. This is just crushed graham crackers. That's all this is. Literally crushed graham crackers. And I did decide to press the crust in. I kind of wish that I had maybe sprinkled the graham cracker on top instead. Oh, so I cut out the portion. You can see I tried to brush the paint and it was wet and it smudged. And just to mix things up with that whipped cream, I used a tip, which I will link in the description, just for a different kind of whipped cream. You know, sometimes you have the smooth whipped cream, and then sometimes, you know, if you have whipped cream out of, well, I guess it's really just whipped cream out of a bottle, then you get the more designed whipped cream, if I'm making any sense right now. Hopefully I am. And doing this pan again. Just a side note, a lot of people ask me about The specs on my cookies, I do use vanilla bean paste because someone does ultimately eat my cookies. I don't just make them for camera. And I think that the Nielsen Massey vanilla bean paste is the way to go. The way to go, my friends. This is a great angle, sort of. I think you can see quite well that I'm actually pulling the icing off the surface of the cookie. You can see the shadow that it creates. That's how I get the nice, beautiful lines. It is important that you allow all of this to dry before you paint on with this paint, with with the sterling pearl. And I think that's why I'm doing the blueberry part first, because that I just piped those lines and it needed some time to actually dry. Now in this case, I do actually definitely need this painted surface because I'm going to be doing some cutouts. Oh yes, this is another kind of, I forgot, this is another kind of pie crust that I did, and something that I will just wax poetic on for a moment. Speaking of cutouts, so I got real lazy with this particular pie cutout. Although I was working with a piping consistency, obviously for the crust in the crust color, I forgot to bag a separate amount in just a normal tipless bag. So when it came to doing this pie crust, this was probably one of the last cookies I did, I would imagine, so I was extra tired. I always recommend that you use a piping consistency to do your outlines for all of your cutouts, and then flood. You can flood both right away or let it dry first. But so I was lazy, and I just was like, well, I'm only doing a couple of these, and these are small cutouts and they don't have to be perfect, so let's just roll with the punches here. And I am using my flood consistency to do those cutouts. Not what I recommend, because as you will see, they will get progressively smaller and smaller because it's a flood consistency. It's not really meant to really hold shape like that. I did let that first pipe kind of sit for just, I don't know, maybe 30 seconds or a minute, not very long. So it could crust ever so slightly, but not too much that it wouldn't be able to blend in with the flood that I just did. That's really important. So that's where I got around. Up next, we're going to be doing, I do believe, yes, some sanding sugar. This is some really, really coarse sanding sugar. It's beautiful, clear sugar. I've got a little Rebel piece of sugar on the pie, so I left this in so you could see me fix it. Handy dandy tweezers, pulling that out while the icing is still wet, so I can then just fix it with my scribe. All is well. And then let that crust move on to the rest of the crust, pun intended. Okay, so this is a similar motion to the pecan pie, except I'm actually, I'm using this tip at in kind of like a V shape. So I am pulling it up at an angle so that I can get more dimension to the back and forth motion. So I know that's really hard to explain over video, but that's kind of the gist. So the pecan pie was a back and forth motion, keeping the tip flush or parallel to the surface of the cookie, whereas what I just did was actually pulling, it was back and forth, but it was pulling up in the backstroke so that it was kind of folding over instead of kind of smushing into itself. If any of that makes sense, it will be a delightful miracle. I know people are going to ask me, how did I get this color? I'm really sorry. I really don't know. I almost always use icing from my freezer and then I add more coloring to it. I really don't know. There's certainly some dark blue in it. There's some bright blue in it. There might even be just a tad of red or purple. That's how you can get really deep blues. But I still wanted it to be a bright blue, because that's what I think of when I think of this kind of pie tin. Like a bright, deep blue. And then, this is the classic pumpkin. I don't know why I needed to sing that, but here we are. Nothing super, super fancy about this one. Also, it was somewhat arbitrary, I suppose, which pie cutter version I picked for each type of pie. You could certainly use the cutter that has the big dollop of whipped cream on top for the pumpkin. This is the same crust that I did already before. I'm blanking on which one that was. I'm looking at this and wishing I hadn't gone quite so far out with my crust on either side. But anyway, so this is another small tip that I'm using. Oh, so cute. Just the little dollops of whipped cream on top. Absolute perfection. So I believe last but certainly not least is our lemon meringue pie. This is another favorite in my household because it's my mom's absolute favorite pie. Absolute favorite. So I've also eaten a lot of lemon meringues in my day. And to me, the focus on this one was all about the meringue. I wanted to make sure that this looked like a realistic meringue. And you'll see what I do is I do a bit of dry dusting. We all know what's going on here. You know what one kind of pie I did not add in here, which I really kind of wish that I did, is, I don't know what the name of it is. It's just like a chocolate pudding pie. I think there's a more official name, where it's like a chocolate pudding center with a crust and then it's topped with a lot of whipped cream and chocolate sprinkles. That is the most important part. It's not a proper chocolate pudding pie or whatever you call it without the chocolate sprinkles. I didn't fall in love with this pie until college. It was one of the, in my opinion, one of the best desserts that they had in the dining hall. Definitely had way too many, but it's just like the texture experience of the whipped cream with the sprinkles. So good. So good. Why am I dreaming about this? That's okay. All right. I think I got a perfect lemon color on here too. Again, I'm not really, maybe one day I will pay better attention to how I make my colors, but really hard for me. I would say this is probably a mix. This is probably mostly lemon yellow with like a tad of egg yellow. Lemon yellow, egg yellow, those are all gel colors by AmeriColor. Doing my same deal here, where I have to paint on 2 layers. Again, if you're ever doing large painting like this, do yourself a favor and make sure that if you can, you are painting it like this before you're doing anything else next to it. Because if you try to go back and paint, it's just a lot more stressful. If, let's say I had done the crust already and then I go back to paint the white silver, unnecessary stress levels, people. Do yourself that favor. Rocking that same crust. I did kind of wish, so I used this technique 3 times. Kind of wish I had done something else for at least one of them for a little more variety, but it's okay, you live, you learn. Using my stiff peak here in a moment. I did decide to use a tip for this because I wanted it to be like perfectly round whipped cream, and I do personally struggle getting a really rounded tip in such a large cut on a tipless bag. So there we are. All right, it is important that you allow that whipped cream to dry completely because you're pressing on it right now with dry dust, and you absolutely do not want to poke a hole in the surface of your icing. That would be very sad. So there we go, is our browned meringue on top of our lemon meringue, and there's the whole set. Oh, they're so cute. They're so cute. Absolutely adorable. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. I really hope that you try one of these yourself. Eat a pie cookie. Go eat some real pie for me, with me. I love pie. I'm gonna go eat some pie right now.